There are people who move through the world with a softness that was not born from peace, but from caution. People who speak gently, not because they were taught kindness, but because loudness once meant danger. People who hesitate before asking for anything. Who freeze when emotions rise. Who fold themselves into smaller versions of who they could have been. They are the ones who silently carry tensions that began years before they understood what tension was. They learned to read the room before they learned to read words. They discovered the weight of responsibility before they discovered the weight of their own needs. Childhood taught them many things. How to endure, how to survive, how to disappear. And even now, as adults, the body remembers what the mind tried to forget. This is the quiet psychology of unresolved childhood tension. There comes a moment in life when a person begins to notice things they have been living with for years, yet never paused long enough to understand. Not dramatic things, not moments of crisis, but small details, tiny hesitations, quiet reactions, the subtle ways their body speaks when their voice cannot. They may catch themselves flinching at a tone that wasn't meant to be harsh, or apologizing for things they didn't do, or tightening their shoulders at the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. They don't know why they do this. They only know it happens. Some people recognize it at work, when conflict makes their mind go blank. Some during conversations when they suddenly shrink inside themselves. Others notice it when someone asks, "Are you okay?" And they respond too quickly, "Yeah, I'm fine," with a smile that feels practiced, almost rehearsed. It is in these moments that quiet recognition begins. A sense that something deeper is moving beneath the surface. Not panic, not distress, just a gentle whisper that says, "This reaction is older than you think." These people often live with emotional patterns that do not match their present lives. They may have stable relationships now, yet still fear disappointing others. They may be safe today, yet still brace for impact. They may be cared for, yet still feel like they must earn that care. There is a disconnect between the life they have and the life their nervous system believes they are still in. A mismatch between memory and reality, between past tension and present calm. And though they don't always understand this tension, they feel it, in their posture, in their breath, in the way their emotions rush or disappear without warning, in the way they look for exits in unfamiliar rooms, or read every expression on a loved one's face, searching for signs of dissatisfaction. This recognition does not arrive dramatically. It arrives slowly, almost gently. A soft questioning. Why do I feel responsible for everyone's comfort? Why do raised voices make my heart race, even when they're not directed at me? Why does peace feel unfamiliar? These questions form the beginning of awareness. They are not accusations. They are not conclusions. They are small openings in the wall a person built long ago. People who quietly carry unresolved childhood tension often assume their reactions are personality traits. They think overthinking is simply how they are. They believe emotional numbness is adulthood. They mistake survival instincts for maturity. But as life slows down and the world grows a little quieter, their internal patterns become more noticeable. They start to see that the tension does not come from who they are today, but from who they once had to be. A child who navigated unpredictable emotions learns to stay alert. An adolescent who mediated family conflict learns to take responsibility for everyone else. A teenager who absorbed other people's moods learns to silence their own. These patterns slip into adulthood disguised as caretaking, patience, maturity, or independence. So when recognition begins, it can be confusing. It challenges the story they tell themselves. It questions the roles they've been playing for decades. It reveals how much of their identity was shaped by environments they never chose. Recognition is rarely loud. It is a quiet shift, a moment where someone sees their reflection, not in a mirror, but in their reactions, and they realize the reflection is younger than they expected. It is the first step toward understanding, though they may not know it yet. Because every form of healing, every unraveling of tension begins with noticing. Noticing the weight, noticing the pattern, noticing the child inside the adult. They may not know the origin of the tension. They may not know its name, but they start to see its shadow. And for the first time, they sense the possibility that the tension is not a flaw, but a story. One that began long before they had words for it. To understand the tension someone carries, you must travel back to the place where their nervous system first learned to contract. Not to blame the past, not to reopen old wounds, but to recognize the environment that shaped the child who lived inside them long before the adult learned to cope. Unresolved childhood tension rarely comes from a single moment. It grows quietly, like a vine curling around the walls of a home. Soft at first, barely visible, then slowly tightening, weaving itself into everything familiar. Some children grew up in houses where emotions felt unpredictable, where a parent's silence could be more frightening than their anger, where every day required scanning for signs of danger, a slammed door, a shift in tone, a sudden change in mood. These children learned early that safety was a moving target. They learned to stay small, to stay quiet, to stay observant, and their bodies learned to anticipate disruption before it even arrived. Others grew up with parents who were physically present but emotionally distant. Adults who fed them, clothed them, cared for them, yet never truly saw them. Children in these homes learned that their feelings had no place to land. Their excitement went unnoticed. Their pain went unacknowledged. Their needs became something to hide. When love feels inconsistent, a child learns to hold tension in their chest, as if tightening their body could earn attention or prevent rejection. There were also children who became caretakers before they understood what caretaking meant. They soothed a crying parent. They calmed arguments they didn't start. They learned to sense emotional weather changes before anyone else could feel them. These children became the emotional anchors of their household, a role far too heavy for hands so small. And then there are homes touched by chaos, financial instability, illness, addiction, grief. In these environments, childhood ends quietly and prematurely. A child's nervous system absorbs the responsibility of survival. The tension that forms is not dramatic. It is not always traumatic in the conventional sense. It is simply constant, a low, humming energy that never truly rests. But tension can also grow in seemingly normal families. Families that looked stable from the outside, yet taught restraint more than expression, where emotions were inconvenient, where vulnerability was uncomfortable, where children were praised for being easy, good, and well-behaved, never realizing that their compliance came from silence, not security. And so the roots of unresolved tension spread quietly, not through tragedy, but through adaptation. A child adapts to whatever environment they are in. They do not question it. They do not challenge it. They learn to blend into it with a loyalty that is almost instinctive. If home required vigilance, they learned vigilance. If home required emotional self-control, they learned to suppress. If home required perfection, they learned to tighten themselves into impossible shapes. If home required invisibility, they learned to disappear without moving. What begins as survival becomes normal. Normal becomes identity. Identity becomes adulthood. And when people grow up carrying these early adaptations, they rarely see them as tension. They see them as their temperament. They say things like, "I don't like conflict. I just want everyone to be okay. I'm used to handling things myself. I don't want to bother anyone." They do not realize that the habits they call personality were forged in environments that asked too much of them and offered too little in return. The body remembers what childhood demanded. The mind builds stories around what the body survived, and the adult learns to function around the tension, never knowing how deeply rooted it is. Unresolved childhood tension is not a single event buried in the past. It is a climate, a landscape, a way of living that shaped who they had to become. And now, as they begin to look back, not with blame, but with quiet understanding, they see where the first knots were tied. Childhood tension does not simply disappear with age. It settles into the body. It shapes the nervous system. It becomes a quiet blueprint that the adult self continues to follow long after the original environment is gone. People often believe that time heals everything, but time only passes. It does not rewrite patterns that were formed in moments of fear, confusion, responsibility, or emotional absence. The body remembers what the mind tries to rationalize, and this memory becomes the psychology of stored stress. In childhood, the brain is still building its circuits, still figuring out how safe the world is, still learning how much space it is allowed to take. When stress becomes chronic, even in subtle, unspoken ways, the brain adapts for survival. It becomes more alert, more cautious, more sensitive to danger, even when danger is mild or inconsistent. This adaptation is called hypervigilance, a state in which the nervous system stays slightly elevated, as if waiting for something to change. A slammed cabinet, a disappointed look, a sudden interruption. The body reacts before the mind understands why. The child learns that safety requires anticipation. The adult continues to anticipate even when nothing threatens them. Another common pattern is fawning, the stress response rarely spoken about. Not fight, not flight, not freeze, but appeasing, trying to keep the peace, trying to soothe potential conflict, trying to become what others need so tension never escalates. This response forms when a child realizes that comfort, attention, or safety come from pleasing others. The adult, years later, still feels responsible for harmony, even when it isn't theirs to maintain. There is also shutdown, a quieter response. When emotions overwhelm, the body numbs itself. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to get through the moment. Children who felt unseen or overstimulated often learn to detach internally. The adult grows accustomed to this distance. They say they are fine because they cannot always feel when they are not. Stored stress shapes attachment too. If early caregivers were unpredictable, a child may grow into an adult who expects abandonment. If affection was conditional, love may feel like a test. If emotions were dismissed, vulnerability may feel unsafe. This does not mean the person is broken. It means their nervous system learned to protect them, and it did so with remarkable loyalty. Psychology describes it simply: patterns formed in survival tend to persist, because the body trusts what kept it alive, even if those patterns no longer serve them. But stored stress does not stay confined to emotions. It speaks through the body: tight shoulders, clenched jaw, a stomach that sinks when someone raises their voice, difficulty breathing when confronted, a heart that beats too fast during minor disagreements, exhaustion that appears without warning. These physical reactions are not failures of strength. They are echoes of early conditioning. The brain's stress response, shaped by years of subtle pressure, activates faster than logic can intervene. It scans for tone changes. It monitors facial expressions. It tracks pauses in conversation. It learns to interpret silence as danger and calmness as temporary. Even positive emotions can feel overwhelming. Joy may feel suspicious. Love may feel fragile. Safety may feel unfamiliar. Because when the nervous system has lived in tension for too long, relaxation becomes a foreign language. Stored stress also affects identity. People may believe they are inherently anxious, overly sensitive, shy, or detached. But these traits are often the mind's attempt to make sense of bodily memory, memory that did not fade when childhood ended. The psychology of stored stress is not about trauma in the dramatic sense. It's about adaptation, about the clever, silent ways a young body found to protect a young mind, and how those protections stayed long after they were needed. Understanding this does not erase the tension, but it explains it. And sometimes, understanding is the first breath a person takes after years of holding it in. There comes a point where the adult self and the child self begin to collide, not loudly, not violently, but quietly, like two tides moving in opposite directions beneath the same surface. This is the inner conflict, the silent war carried by people who grew up holding tension they never learned to release. They want closeness. They crave connection. Yet a part of them flinches when someone gets too near. Another part feels relieved when people pull away. And then another part aches at the distance. It is not inconsistency. It is the nervous system pulling in two directions at once. One direction whispers, "You are safe now." The other warns, "You weren't safe then." The body trusts the second voice more because it remembers. They long to relax, but their muscles refuse. Stillness feels suspicious. Calmness feels temporary. Their mind says, "Nothing is wrong," but the body quietly replies, "Something might be." This conflict appears in subtle behaviors, overthinking every word they send, reading between lines that were never written, apologizing for the slightest discomfort they might cause, preparing for rejection even when none is present. It is a tug-of-war between wanting to be understood and fearing what will happen if they are. People often mistake this conflict for emotional instability, but it is simply the nervous system attempting to balance two truths: the desire for connection and the fear of vulnerability. For some, closeness feels like a risk. Not because they don't value it, but because closeness once exposed them to inconsistency, criticism, or emotional unpredictability. So they protect themselves, sometimes by withdrawing, sometimes by over-explaining, sometimes by becoming the peacemaker, hoping that if they keep everything calm, tension will never return. Yet while they protect themselves, they also feel lonely, not for lack of people, but because emotional distance becomes their default posture. They watch themselves push away the very comfort they crave, and they don't understand why. Others experience the opposite. They cling, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, subtle longing for reassurance. They fear silence. They interpret pauses as distance. They expect affection to fade, and when it does not, they fear losing it anyway. The conflict grows deeper when positive experiences arrive. A healthy relationship, a gentle friend, a safe environment. These things feel unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity can trigger survival instincts. The adult says, "Let it in." The child warns, "Be careful." Both voices speak from truth. Both want protection. Neither knows how to lead. This internal tension also appears in self-worth. People who carry unresolved childhood stress often struggle to believe they deserve ease. Kindness feels foreign. Affection feels conditional. Being prioritized feels suspicious. They may sabotage opportunities not out of incompetence, but because success once created pressure. They may avoid conflict, not because they fear disagreement, but because disagreement once meant danger. They may hold back their emotions, not because they lack depth, but because depth was once too heavy to carry alone. And so the adult self tries to move forward while the child self pulls back, not to harm them, but to protect them from a threat that no longer exists. This is the inner conflict. Two versions of the same person trying to navigate one life. It is important to understand that resistance is not weakness. It is loyalty. Loyalty to the patterns that once kept them safe. Loyalty to the child who survived what the adult now analyzes. The nervous system does not differentiate past from present. It only remembers what once helped. And the person, caught between who they were and who they are becoming, feels this tension as confusion, indecision, self-doubt, or emotional exhaustion. Yet beneath the conflict lies something else, a quiet truth. The very presence of this struggle means growth is happening, because only when a person begins to outgrow an old survival pattern does the pattern begin to resist. Realization does not arrive like a sudden awakening. It rarely feels dramatic. More often it slips in quietly, soft as a breath, gentle as a memory resurfacing without warning. It begins in moments when something inside finally pauses long enough to listen. Perhaps during a conversation that feels too familiar. Perhaps during an argument that leaves them emptier than angry. Perhaps during a moment of affection that feels strangely difficult to receive. It can come from therapy, from exhaustion, from heartbreak, or from observing a repeated pattern they can no longer ignore. Whatever the source, realization often begins with a whisper. This isn't just who I am. This is something I learned. For people carrying unresolved childhood tension, this moment can feel unsettling because it challenges the identity they've held for years. It asks them to consider the possibility that their reactions are not personality flaws, but protective strategies shaped in rooms they no longer live in. Sometimes the realization arrives when they witness someone else respond differently, someone who does not flinch at raised voices, who expresses needs without shame, who receives kindness without suspicion. And they wonder, why does this feel so impossible for me? Or it happens when a friend says, "You always seem so tense," and the words land heavier than expected. Not because they are judgmental, but because they echo a truth the person has long felt but never acknowledged. Realization can also appear during silence. In the middle of a quiet night, when the world finally stops asking for anything, and the body releases tension it has been holding for years. In that release, there is clarity, a recognition that the tightness is older than adulthood. Many people describe this realization as disorienting, as if they are meeting themselves for the first time, a version of themselves that feels both familiar and foreign. They begin connecting dots they never knew existed, why certain tones trigger their anxiety, why conflict makes them shut down, why peace feels temporary, why affection feels undeserved. The realization is not intellectual, it is emotional, it is bodily. It is a sudden understanding that their nervous system is not malfunctioning. It is remembering. This understanding often brings a quiet grief, not the dramatic grief of tragedy, but the soft mourning of a child who carried more than they should have. Grieving the pressure they normalized, grieving the safety they never fully felt, grieving the version of themselves that learned to cope alone. But intertwined with this grief is something else. Relief. The relief of naming what was once shapeless. The relief of recognizing that their reactions have roots. And those roots are not signs of weakness, but evidence of strength. Because it takes strength to survive a childhood that demanded maturity too early. It takes strength to hold tension without breaking. It takes strength to grow into adulthood while carrying a past that never had closure. The realization also brings with it a gentle loosening. Not healing yet, but the first softness, like the first breath after a long pause, like unclenching a fist without knowing it was clenched. They may feel moments where connection suddenly feels clearer, as if their mind is finally witnessing the present without filtering everything through the past. Or moments where they notice themselves preparing for danger that isn't there, and instead of reacting automatically, they pause, just long enough to see the pattern. This pause is powerful. It is the space between the past and the present, the space where awareness begins, the space where people realize that although the child learned to survive, the adult can learn to live differently. This is not transformation, not yet. It is recognition, the moment where a person stops blaming themselves and begins understanding themselves. And understanding, quiet, patient, compassionate understanding, is often the turning point where old tension begins to loosen by the smallest possible degree. There comes a moment, often quiet and unannounced, when a person begins to sense that something inside them is asking to soften. Not necessarily to be fixed, not rewritten or erased, just softened. Like a fist that has been clenched for too many years, finally recognizing the shape of its own exhaustion. For those who carry unresolved childhood tension, healing rarely begins with a grand decision. It begins with a faint internal shift, a small exhale they didn't know they were holding, a sentence spoken with unexpected honesty, a boundary that trembles but finally stands, a memory that is finally acknowledged without the instinct to look away. And often it begins without their permission, because the body remembers long before the mind agrees to listen. It remembers the nights their voice was too small to matter. It remembers the sharp edges of homes filled with unpredictability. It remembers bracing for reactions they could never predict. And as they grow older, it quietly nudges them toward the places where the tension can finally loosen. Healing is not a transformation. It is a return, a slow return to the self they had to postpone in order to survive. They start to recognize the early signs of stress not as weakness, but as messages. Signals from a younger version of themselves asking not to be dismissed again. They notice how their shoulders lift whenever they sense conflict, how their breath shortens during moments of emotional closeness, how they apologize before speaking, even when they've done nothing wrong. And instead of shaming themselves for it, they begin, gently, to observe. Observation becomes the first form of self-protection that doesn't come from fear. It comes from awareness. And slowly, awareness softens into compassion. Compassion changes the tone of their inner world. It introduces a new kind of voice inside them, one that doesn't rush, doesn't blame, doesn't panic. A voice that speaks the way someone should have spoken to them long ago, calm, measured, steady. They start to notice that the tension they carry isn't an enemy, it's a memory, a living archive of moments where they didn't feel safe. And when they realize this, something shifts. Instead of trying to outrun their past, they turn toward it with a kind of cautious curiosity. The body responds first. Their breathing deepens on its own. They find themselves resting more fully in conversations that once made them guarded. Their emotions rise without the immediate instinct to shut them down. Tears come more honestly, less strategically. Anger stings less sharply and passes more cleanly. And slowly they learn that feeling isn't a threat, it's information. Healing, for them, is rarely dramatic. It doesn't involve sudden breakthroughs or perfect clarity. Instead, it unfolds in the small spaces of daily life, in how they sit with silence, in how they let someone's affection land without flinching, in how they notice their own needs before they become overwhelming, in how they practice choosing themselves in situations where they once disappeared. But the most profound shift happens in their relationship with the past. They stop trying to rewrite it. They stop arguing with it. They stop pretending it was different. Instead, they learn to hold it with steady hands, without fear of breaking. Some memories sting, some memories ache, some memories still tremble inside them, but they are no longer meeting those memories with the childlike instinct to hide. They are meeting them as the adult they've become, an adult who now has the safety, the perspective, and the emotional space that once didn't exist. Healing is not forgetting. Healing is not becoming someone new. Healing is the slow integration of every version of themselves into a single, cohesive whole. The child who braced, the teenager who shut down, the adult who learned to function without fully living, and the emerging self who is learning quietly to trust the world again. This integration doesn't erase the tension, it simply loosens it. It gives it breath. It makes room for the person they were always meant to grow into. And with time, with gentleness, with honesty, they begin to discover something extraordinary. the world feels less threatening. Connections feel less dangerous, stillness feels less unfamiliar, and their own presence, once foreign, begins to feel like home. Healing, in the end, is not a destination. It is a direction, a slow return to a self that was never broken, only burdened, only paused, only waiting. In the end, it is not the dramatic moments that define a person's healing, it's the quiet ones. The ones that pass unnoticed by the world but change everything inside them. A person who spent years holding unresolved childhood tension knows this better than anyone, because silence has always been their oldest companion. The silence of things they couldn't say. The silence of feelings they weren't allowed to feel. The silence of a child who learned to adapt before they ever learned to exist. But somewhere along the path, often without realizing it, they begin listening to that silence differently. Not as a threat, not as a reminder of what they had to endure, but as a space where their truth, once buried, can finally take shape. Close your eyes and imagine them standing in a quiet room. No audience, no expectations, no need to perform resilience. Just a single moment suspended in time where they are allowed to be exactly as they are. This is where the quiet finally speaks. It does not speak in loud revelations. It does not demand answers or apologies. It speaks softly, almost shyly, as if afraid of being dismissed again. It says things like, "You were never difficult. You were never too much. You were a child, surviving. You were worthy long before anyone saw it." These truths feel foreign at first, like words borrowed from a language they never learned to trust. But with time, they begin to fit. They begin to settle. They begin to feel like home. And in this settling, something remarkable happens. The tension that lived inside them for so long stops being a constant state. It becomes a story, one they can hold without drowning in it. They start seeing their past not as a wound that defines them, but as a landscape they have walked through, a terrain shaped by neglect, unpredictability, or emotional distance, a terrain they survived long enough to name, and now, long enough to leave. They look back with a strange tenderness, not because the past was gentle, it wasn't, but because they can finally see the child they were with clear eyes. A child who tried. A child who held their breath around conflict. A child who learned to anticipate moods like weather forecasts. A child who carried responsibility that belonged to adults. A child who, despite everything, found a way to grow. They realize that healing is not about undoing this child's story. It is about honoring them, meeting them, integrating them, letting them take a seat inside the life that once felt too large for them. And when this integration happens, even subtly, the world feels different. They notice softness where there was once armor. They notice breath where there was once bracing. They notice presence where there was once performance. They notice life where there was once only survival. There is a moment, quiet, ordinary, when they understand something few ever say out loud. They survived childhood by becoming small. Now, they heal by allowing themselves to expand, not outwardly, not loudly, but inwardly, in the private relationship they hold with themselves. The expansion is gentle. It shows up in the way they speak to their own exhaustion, in the way they allow themselves to rest, in the way they no longer apologize for taking up space that always belonged to them, in the way they breathe without asking for permission, and eventually, almost imperceptibly, they begin to trust themselves. A trust that was once fractured by the unpredictability of the world around them now grows like something steady and rooted. They trust their own voice. They trust their own rhythm. They trust their capacity to feel without being overtaken. They trust that connection doesn't have to hurt. They trust that they can walk into the future without repeating the past they carried for so long. And perhaps the most healing truth of all, they discover that nothing inside them was ever broken. Only protected, only waiting, only bracing until it felt safe enough to unfurl. In this final chapter of their internal story, the person who once lived in tension learns a softer way of being. A way where the past is acknowledged, the present is inhabited, and the future is approached with quiet steadiness. Not with certainty, not with perfection, but with presence. And presence, for someone who lived their whole life anticipating the next emotional tremor, is its own form of freedom. The script closes here, not with an ending, but with a continuation. A slow, steady, quiet return to themselves.